In this exercise, we revisit the classic models database, and we will address some of the queries about date times. In this database, the payment table has a payment date field. We're going to operate on the payment table, and we're going to answer these following queries. We're going to report the total payments by date, by year, by month, by year quarter, and also on a bi-yearly basis, each 6 months in each year. So the first few ones are kind of repetitive. The next two ones are slightly more challenging, and the last one requires us to use a date-time operations. For the rest of ones, for the easy ones, I'm going to show you how to address these queries either by using datetime or by using string operations. Now don't forget that the first key entry of using datetime operation in pandas is to convert the field from being text to being datetime. Once you do this, the datetime object, in this example here the timestamp object, has attributes that allow us to access the subcomponents of this object, such as the value of the year, the value of the month, the value of the day, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to load the tables. Each table will be loaded in one data frame, and we're going to work on the payments date for now, the payment table for now. The first question is asking us to report the total payment by date. And you can see here that the total payment has a payment date column. So what we can do, we can sort values by payment date. And that's if the question was asking us to report them as sorted per date. Now some of these payments may occur on the same date. If this is the case, we can group by date and we can do sum payment to get the sum of payments. I'm not so sure this is the case in here. The date seems to be distinct so far, but generally speaking, we can do a datetime, a group by operation. We can group by payment date. If the question was about aggregations, we can do payments group by payment date. And then once we group by, we need to get the amount, because this is going to, if I do the sum, this is going to give us the sum of everything, including customer number, which it doesn't make sense to sum customer number per date. What makes sense is to sum the amount per date. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pull amount first and then do sum to get the sum of amount for each one of these dates. Now obviously if you look here, you can see that this operation is almost meaningless because we don't have multiple payments, many payments in general in each day. Actually we can double check. We can do count here instead of sum, and we can sort values ascending false, and that should tell us if there are payments, more than one payment in the same date, which is actually the case for some of these dates. Some of these dates have 3 or 2 payments, but most of them so far have one payment. Like how many? Okay, we can take a look at this one and we can call the function value counts. And you can see that 195 days have one payment, 33 days have 2 payments, and 4 days have 3 payments. Okay, so probably it makes sense to do this, for instance, instead of doing it per day, maybe per week. Just make this observation period a bit larger so we can get more meaningful summaries. So we can do it per year, we can do it per month, and we can do it over time, year, month, year, quarter, and so on. Let's do it per year first. We have a couple of options of doing it per year. One option is to basically use string operations. So we can take a look at payments here and realize that the payment date is formatted in a way that here is the first few characters. So I can take a look at my payment date and then str to 4, that's going to give me the year. Let's store this one as years, and then this is a series. I can payments group by years, and then take amount and take the sum. And that's going to give me the sum of these amounts per year. Okay, the other way to do this is when we take a look at our payments table to format payment date as a datetime object, because this one is so far a string column. So what I can do, I can pass this column to the function to datetime. Again, this function is a universal function, so it can take a series and we can get a series of datetime objects rather than string objects. So what we do with this series, I can store it as a series, or I can store it as a column, as a new column in my data frame. Let's call it date for now. So I modified my data frame so that I have a new column called date in this case. Now what I'm going to do with dates, I'm going to look at the year. And that's because if we take a look at this column here, I can apply function that peeks into the year component in each one of these datetime objects. And this one will give us the year in each one of them. Of course, not payment date, but rather date. Payment date is a string, so it doesn't have a year attribute, but date has a year attribute. So what do I do with it? It's exactly the same thing as this one. I can store this one as years. Let's call it years 2 so that we don't override years. And the same applies here. Payment group by years 2. Get that here. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to take a look at my data frame here and re-index it by date. So I'm going to set index date. Once I set the index to date, I can resample my data frame. So I'm going to resample to a yearly basis here. And that's going to give me kind of like an aggregation object, a resampler object here. And what I can do with it is very similar to this operation. I can take a look at the amount and do the sum. And here I get the sum per year. What's nice about this thing compared to this one is that once you convert it, you can resample by any frequency. It can be year, it can be month, it can be quarter, it can be any of the date periods that you can create. Business month start, you can do that. You can resample by the start of each business month and take the numbers. So it's quite powerful once we do the datetime object. Working manually with string is limited, and actually it's limited to only the first 4 questions, because 3 questions, because we can extract year, months, year, and months, but we cannot do year quarter with string, and you cannot buy yearly with string. Okay, so let's do the month really quickly. The month is very similar to the year here. What I'm going to do, I can use one of the 3 strategies here. I can either use the string operations, because the string operations here, if I'm going to do months, is going to be not only the 4 characters, but rather I need a dash, so I get the 5, 6, and 7. So that's the first 6 characters. Let's call this one month here. And I can group by month, and I will get the average per each one of these, the sum per each one of the months. Not the average, but rather the sum. Second strategy still applies here. I don't need to recreate the column, it's been created, so I can peek into the attribute month. Let's call this one month 2. And this is month. And then I can group by month 2, do the amount, and do the sum. Now this one is giving me a different result than this one, because x.month is giving me the month of the date, which basically means that everything in January is grouped together. So let's read the question one more time. Actually, the question is asking me about the month rather than the year month. So the question here is asking me to report it by the month and then by the year month. So what we've done with the string operation is basically answer the question, the next question here. So here I need to get 3 to 7 because I want to group by the month itself rather than the year month. It's actually not 3, it's 4 digits of the year, so that's basically 5 to 7 here, excluding the dash. Okay, or we can extract the months and we get the months here. Once again, notice that with this string operations, we're reverse engineering how the date time is formatted in the string. So we've already done the next question. Now we can do, next step is to do year months, which is basically beginning to 7. And that's the year months. And if we want to do it using the second strategy, instead of formatting it as month, we can format it as year and month. So we can do x.year, comma, x.month, and that's going to give us the year and month for each one of them. Here I put them in a tuple, but I can format them in a string if I wish to. So if I want to format it as a string, instead of doing a tuple, I can probably do a formatted string here. End it here. That will take each one of these date-time values and format it as a formatted string. Okay, forget the parentheses here. Would be very similar to this one, except that this one doesn't have the leading 0 after January. So I can add a formatting directive to format this first component as 2 digits. So we don't get the leading 0, we get a leading space and 1. Once again, I'm not going to worry about the exact formatting here. The question is about grouping these by dates as long as those months are showing up in their natural order. So those two results should be the same, should be consistent. Another way to do the grouping operation is to take a look at the new column date, because the new column date is, in a date time format. So what I can do with it, I can convert it to period using the function to period here, and I have months as a parameter here. So it probably doesn't work until it's converted to a datetime index. So I'm going to use the function datetime index and pass the series to it. And then I can call the function to period and month. That basically converts each one of these dates to a month, looking at the month period here. So instead of doing this manually here or semi-manually here, I can basically group by this thing here. So let's call this one month 3, and then I can do group by month 3, and then take a look at amount sum, the same basic result here. Okay, so that will give me the same numbers as in the first two approaches. So first one is using the string operation. The second one is using a datetime field, but kind of manually or semi-automatically formatting it as monthly periodicity. This one is using the built-in function to period, but this built-in function requires converting the datetime series to a datetime index. Finally, yet the last approach we will do is to use the resample function. We've used this one before, and I'm going to set the index to be date and then resample to each month, take the amount and the sum, and that will basically give us the same result. So different ways to get to the same answer here. Question is asking us basically to do this on a yearly quarter basis. So that basically requires uncovering the quarter of each one of these datetime objects. So all of the approaches except the string approach will not work because there is no way to tease out the quarter from the string. To tease out the quarter from the string, either we need to write our own function saying that if months is 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 1, 2, 3, it's Q1, 4, 5, 6 is Q2, Q3 and Q4. That's kind of manually recreating this function, or we can use these datetime operations, and we get the quarter of each year. Instead of months, we can do quarters. So we can either use this approach, and we do it with quarters. So instead of months, I have quarters here, and I'm going to take each quarter here. I don't need the directive here. Q ranges from 1 to 4, so there is no need to format it. And instead of grouping by months, I can group by quarters here. And here I get the result per quarter. Or I can take the second approach, and the second approach is basically converting this to datetime index on a quarterly basis. So let's call this one quarters here. Quarters 2 and quarters 2. The 2 period should be Q rather than months because I want to read on a quarterly basis. So I get same numbers slightly formatted differently, Q1, Q2, Q4. And the last approach still works fine. I'm going to resample, but instead of resampling per month, I'm going to resample per quarter, and I get here the same result, the same numbers at the end of each quarter. The last question, which is asking us to run the same numbers on a bi-yearly basis, is the one that we need to use resampling. Now we can use the previous strategies, but if we end up using the previous strategies, we need to write some helper functions. For instance, we need to take a year, and based on the year value, you need to take a month, and based on the month's value, if it's 1 to 6, it's half 1. If it's 7 to 12, it's half 2. The only way to avoid writing extra functions is to use the resample function. So on a bi-yearly basis, what I'm going to do, I'm going to resample my data, but I'm going to resample my data not on a month basis, but on a 6 months basis. So that basically will give me the same information in the first 6 months, in the next 6 months of 2003, first 6 months in 2004, next 6 months in 2004, and so on. I want the start of the month rather than the end of the month. I'm going to do 6 month start. So it's going to be the start in the beginning of the first month in the period and at the end of the 6th month of the period. Let's see how we can achieve the same by using a helper function. So here is my payments here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to take a look at date, and I'm going to apply lambda x to be x.month. Now x.month here is going to be 1 to 12, right? So if it's less than if it's less than 7, I'm going to make it half 1. Else is going to be half 2. So that basically will say this is the second half or the first half of the year. But I still want to add this to the year, so I'm going to be strx.year plus this thing, plus a dash, plus this thing. That's kind of manually so plus this whole thing in parentheses, and again you can see that trying to force this in a one-liner is kind of tricky here, but that's basically, instead of putting year plus months, year dash months, it's year dash half1 or hash2 depending on the value of the month. So let's call this one half year. And then I'm going to do the payments group by half year. The same syntax that we had here, half year, and then amount, and then take the sum. It basically gives us the same numbers, but it's kind of creating this manually rather than doing it within the built-in resample function.